I think I noticed everybody in the room. Thanks for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. Hope you find some value out of what we're going to produce tonight. So we decided after some feedback from the user group that every once in a while we're kind of going to do a basics kind of presentation. But more, it's an opportunity for you guys to ask a lot of questions. So we're going to try to hit the tool kind of end to end, providing a lot of tips and tricks along the way, and kind of shoot at it from there.
Is this being recorded?
It is.
It will be
currently a live event, and yeah, the recording will be up. We'll put it up on our YouTube channel, the PowerBI.Tips YouTube channel.
So you can bring it back to your teams and talk to them about all the amazing things that they missed out on, and the free pizza. And you guys don't get free pizza, so you gotta come in. You gotta come in person for the free pizzas.
Most people in the room know who we are, but for those of them people online, welcome. My name is Seth Bauer. I'm the Director of Business Intelligence at a company called Syndigo. I spend a lot of time on the Power BI community, doing blogging, speaking, and Mike and I are co-owners of PowerBI.Tips, where obviously we do a lot of things related to building tools, blogs, and a lot of fun stuff like that. So also co-runners of the Power BI user group, and love Power BI. Obviously, you know this because we keep seeing us all the time.
Week after week, I mean month after month after month. Yeah. Mike Carlo, again, for those, I am an independent consultant working for Power BI stuff, so I just do everything Power BI related. Creator of the Power BI Tips website and run it with Seth. We co-run that website as well as help out with the PUG group. So just build a bunch of cool content. I will put a shameless plug in there. This month we were able to release, I don't know if you saw the announcement in I think it was the October release. The October release had a Power BI desktop file, a PBIDS file type that was recently released. So we just built a quick tool around the Power BI desktop source files, which essentially is JSON inside a file where you can then say, here are some properties about a connection type, right? So if I'm going to connect to a SQL server, I can drop in the SQL server name in the database. And when you click the file, it'll automatically bring up Power BI Desktop and preload that connection for you to make it a bit easier for people to type in the right connection pieces, and then prompt you to log in. So if your user has credentials or access, you can then sign in, and then it'll let you right into whatever that source is, database, folder, could be whatever. We'll try to demo one tonight, potentially, on that tool. I'll just show you kind of maybe how it works if we get more time here at the end, and we'll see how it works. So that was a cool new feature out this month, but for now, we're gonna do some just kind of basic stuff. I think at a high level, we're going to try to go through, you want me to do the act like the business, think like IT start point to kind of high level everything?
I would never stop you from doing that.
Yes. Okay, so I have the nice pretty whiteboard behind us. So one concept that we've been kind of batting around this idea back and forth a number of times, and we've kind of been mulling over the idea, and for lack of a better term, there's this phrase, what we want to use is kind of act like the business, but think like IT. So the business needs to move quickly. We need to get reports out. We've got to deliver things. So that's really the concept behind a lot of this. What you're going to see tonight is we're going to start talking about or showing you kind of some examples of how do we see that think like IT place idea. You know, we need to think about sustainability. We need to think about, you know, dev QA prod. We need to think about repeatably building on data models and continually enhance them, but we want people to build multiple reports from the same data model. So tonight's going to be a bit of a demo around that piece. We're going to kind of weave that story in across a lot of other little basics that we're going to do. But the concept at its core is really around, we have a user out here, and he wants to build some sort of data model. And so typically what we do is we build a data model plus a report. It's kind of all bolted into the same PBIX. So this is kind of like one big PBIX file. And in the IT realm, you see the equivalent happening where you build analysis services. So analysis services is the engine that runs both Power BI Desktop and the model piece. In the IT space, you see Azure Analysis Services, plus you're seeing like PBIX files connecting. This is like a direct, a live connection back to analysis services. The idea being we have a controlled version of a Visual Studio analysis services file. We can edit the data. We can check it into code using GitHub. So the pattern here is kind of very similar. So the pattern we're going to talk through tonight is, let's think about building our reports or models with kind of two parts. So we can have one person kind of building the data model piece, and then we can have another individual kind of iterating on the report piece. So and this is one of our stories will be. So the idea the reason we do this is because then we can have one data model support many different reports, and we're not making the same data set every single time. So if you kept publishing a report and data set together, when you publish it to workspaces, you could have multiple reports having the same data set across multiple workspaces. The idea here is we want to reuse. This is like the think like IT space. We want to reuse this work that we've built over and over again. So the goal here is to build one report and then many other reports that also hang off of that same data model. So we'll show you how to do that tonight, and that's kind of the concept we're working through. It's not a perfect IT model by any means, but it's kind of like a starting point, and we're finding this pattern is working well for projects that we're working on, and we hope it helps out for you guys to build some of your projects.
Yeah, I think you'll start to hear this theme a lot more from us and what we're going to be doing, because I think it's been matriculating for a while in how we've presented things, but very often when requests come in for reports a lot and all the time, a lot of the time as report authors, we're just building the report, right? And then it's the next one. So in essence, we're almost creating that same Excel hell type thing where you have these files that are compartmentalized pieces of what could be a larger model. So in the enterprise space, a lot more thought is given around creating a singular model that carries an entire area of business or the entirety of the business. But on a more micro level, in the Power BI report, we're basically just bringing up that there are concepts and things that you can think about as you're developing a report to get that extension of repeatability in just using Power BI.
All right, enough about yakking. That's the high-level view we're going through. We'll do as much demo as we can to kind of get through everything. We're going to probably do about a full hour of this, and then we're going to stop the live recording, and then we'll just do open questions Q&A for here locally, because that's why you guys come. You guys get the advantage of doing the Q&A, whatever you want after the fact, and we don't want to put that stuff on the internet either, so this is just the presentation part. So I'm going to hide behind the camera, and Seth's going to take it away.
I would say interrupt as much as you possibly want to.
Yes, ask as many questions as you can. This is not just...
So kind of in a fictitious path rather than just throwing a bunch of things at you as far as the tooling is concerned. What we're going to walk through tonight is Bill, the sales guy, is coming in and requesting that we put some metrics or visualization around some of the sales numbers that he has in an Excel spreadsheet. So one of the first things that we do in Power BI is go and get data. Mike did a really good blog around the use of SharePoint folders. And let me just grab the link here. But by sticking our Excel files or SharePoint lists, et cetera, from this folder, essentially when we connect here on the top level, it shows us all of the objects that we can connect to as data sources without the folder structure. So what we'll see is in this site of SharePoint Power BI demo site, there are multiple different folders underneath this structure, but it just returns to me all of the different files that I can connect to as a data source. So I'm going to transform this data, which opens up the Power Query editor. Within here, we have my file, the product sales customer, which is the file that Bill, the sales guy, has sent me. And I can navigate to this file directly from Power BI as it's understanding that structure, and it's going to eventually import that Excel file for me. So now I have that table, which I can click on, and I'm returned that Excel file from the SharePoint folder. This is a great way to extend not only just a single file, but in that navigation, I can filter down to a series of files and combine those all in one fell swoop and have a single query rather than multiple different Excel queries. Right. So go ahead.
I'm a little dumb when it comes to this. will that query that you set up here be able to go in and automatically refresh data as new data goes into those sheets?
And make sure you repeat the question for the guys on the phone too.
Well, that threw me off. Will it refresh the data from the sheets that are in that SharePoint folder?
As they're updated.
Absolutely. So the other thing we could do is say you have a folder that contains a series of Excel files. I can set a filter that says, look for this first part of the extension. For instance, my name is Excel file and the date stamp, which is pretty common when we're working with a lot of Excel files. If I have that in my filter set, anytime a new file is dropped into that SharePoint folder, it'll automatically get picked up in the Power BI report.
Excellent.
And there's no dumb questions. Feel free to ask any number of questions.
This is the ask anything question.
Ask anything you want. So this is exactly why we're doing this.
So
great question.
If you're not familiar with Power Query, which I think the vast majority are, but a couple things I want to point out for everybody. One is under View here, we have the ability to enable.
We're not seeing your Power Query. We're seeing the desktop. So maybe
only sharing that one
you
screen.
might be sharing just the one screen.
Technical difficulties. Hold, please.
Please hold. Screen one. Yeah, there we go. We got it now.
Is this formula editor bar. So this is a toggle that you can enable or disable in your options, or under View, enable it right here. What's great about this is when we connect to a data source and we begin to interact with that data source, applied steps are created on the right-hand side. For each one of these applied steps, as I click on this, you'll notice that the code in that formula bar changes to the M code or the mashup language of that particular applied step that we're selecting in the UI. So as I go through here, and for instance, on the product key, I want to change this data type to a text field. I'll change the order type to just date instead of time, and then go over and change my customer key as a text field as well. And you'll notice that since I'm making the same type of change all at the same time, all of these changed types are going to be in one line of code. A bit advanced, but just to let you know that it's there, essentially all of these applied steps can be found underneath the advanced editor, which is under the home ribbon right in the top here. And go ahead.
I was going to point out, Seth did an interesting thing here. Like when you're changing data types, a lot of like newbie people, when I see working in the query editor, they'll do remove one column and then rename one column, and then remove one column and rename one column. And what will happen is you'll get a bunch of additional steps. Not that it's wrong, but it's a bit more efficient to do them all in one step. So what we showed you here, if you're renaming all the data types, kind of the two, as you leave the query editor, steps you should do is make sure you've removed the columns you need to remove, then make sure they're named the way you want them named, and then make sure they're named the same way. So if you do those three steps at the end, if you don't do them earlier in the process, they won't add extra steps that you don't need to. It'll kind of consolidate all those steps into the same individual line of code that Seth's showing you here.
So one of the reasons why I point out the advanced editor right away is I want to demystify what's happening behind the scenes. We're creating a lot of clicks. We can do a lot of powerful things that generate a bunch of functions to transform our data, but the nitty-gritty of everything that we're doing in the UI is essentially just this code block. So what's really neat is, say you have a Power BI file where you've gone through this entire ETL step, you can open up another Power BI desktop file and create a blank query, copy and paste this in there, or better yet, just copy Control-C the object and Control-V or drag it over into the other desktop, and it automatically creates itself. So it's the code itself is what's generating behind it. And as you become more familiar with Power Query and these functions, the advanced editor is the next evolution of, as you start to get it more advanced, it's extremely powerful for a couple of things from my standpoint. Changing data sources, because the data source string, I can create a new blank query of, for instance, if I start off in a SQL database, and that's my connection string, and then that changes to an analysis services model or something to that effect, I can create a new connection. That's a bad one, an Excel file to SQL Server. The point is I'll have a series of how I go and grab this SharePoint folder versus an Excel file. But if I'm going to change that, I can create the new query and then just grab the source and next strings to replace my current code on the top so that I don't have to remove all of my transformation steps that I did after I ingested that file, if that makes sense.
So you're changing the back.
Yep, for the most part. The only difference is there's a couple steps as it relates to, like, this one's a good example from the standpoint that I'm connecting to a higher level folder. I'm opening a binary, I'm expanding the table, and then setting the first row as headers. If I connect to an Excel file, I don't need those steps, and my query would break. But if I had 20 other steps below this, reshaping, adding custom columns, conditional formatting, you know, et cetera, I can do all of that pretty easily. So now that I have this change type, just to look at the data a little bit, what we have, which every salesperson certainly has in all of their reports, is keys, right? Kidding. So I'm cheating. I'm cheating a little bit today. So we have some product information, the order date, the unit price, sales amount, the product name, and then some information about the product. So color, size, weight, and model name. And then we have a little bit of information around the customer. So we have a customer key, another nice cheat that I'm taking in, along with the email address, first name, and last name. So now that we have our data set, all we have to do is close and apply this, and that gets added into our Power BI report, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with. So what we're going to do is we're just going to create some simple reports that will show Bill, the sales guy, how easy it is to build some visualizations for him, and we can move on. So if we take the order date, and just to point out, which by default, in options, what Power BI does for you now for every single date that you ingest is create a date dimension behind the scenes. This does consume a lot of memory and size in your model. So if you don't want that to happen, you can disable that in the options. By disabling it, it will only ever show the date. But if you don't disable it, this is why we get the ability to have year, quarter, month, day always as a drop-down when we're using just a date that we pulled in. Does that make sense? So in this case, I don't want that hierarchy, and I want the sales amount, and I'm just going to look at that over time. Yep.
So if that option is unselected, then we won't be able to filter by the specific date range, right? What you
would do, and what I would recommend, is you actually bring in your own date dimension. If there are really simple DAX, summarized tables, DAX query functions that'll create that object within your model for you, and if you want to go really deep, Marco Russo at SQL BI has probably one of the most comprehensive date dimension tables you will ever find related to all of the different time series, all of the different fiscal calendars. You can modify with parameter. It's like the be all and end all of date dimensions. And then that is your date dimension within your model.
So performance-wise, it's the recommended option.
Absolutely. Yeah. Especially if you have a lot of dates. Essentially you can get yourself in a lot of trouble from the standpoint of if you bring in this sales table and there was a blank date or something and it goes all the way back to 1900, which happens sometimes, but for every single column that you have in all of your queries, a date dimension is being created. So if you have a lot of dates in your data, you know, even 5, 6, 7, 8 dates, you have 8 different date dimensions that are just hanging off of those and will bloat your model in really large terms.
Where do you turn it off? You know, if you're going to do that approach, where do you turn it off?
So under File, Options and Settings, if you've never been here, go spend some time in here, because there's a whole slew of things that will change the views, enable different things from a preview perspective. So here's your preview features. You can enable all of the things that are in preview and not GA yet within the tool. Report settings. The smart guides, you'll notice I have those disabled by default because we use a lot of our own layouts and backgrounds and things like that, and they kind of get in the way. And then in terms of
data load,
we're talking about
data. Yeah, it's current file data load.
Auto date time for new
There you go.
files.
Yep.
So if you don't want that behavior to happen, you would check that off.
But if you want the filter, you have to bring the date tables.
Yes.
So this would mean that you would bring your own date dimension in so that you could use those different time slices that you would want to use in your report.
So I have order date, birth date, and transaction date. How do I apply the table to each of those different dates?
So you'd build that within the model itself. So if there were three, if there were three different, Michael, chime in.
Go ahead.
Sorry. So there's a couple things. If they're in different tables, you don't have an issue. You just create a different relationship from your date dimension to each one of those other tables. If they're all within the same one, what I'd recommend is you'd still create 3 relationships to that model or to that table. You would just drive which one you're using based on the DAX measure that you would create. So if you wanted to go sum of whatever by birth date, that would be that calculation. If you wanted to do, which could be the default. If you wanted to do sum of whatever by higher date or whatever the other date is, you just use a use relationship to specify that inactive relationship is the one that you wanted to use, and then your visual would work appropriately.
So I think this is a good opportunity for a quick whiteboard on what you're asking, because there's actually a third kind of option that's in there as well, and it really depends on what you're putting on the visual. So the first part that Seth was talking about was there's 2 fact tables, right? We have 2 tables. This has a date column. This has a date column. How do I link those together? How do I get a date table that tags onto both of those? And this makes a lot of sense when you have a single date table, right? So you'll put a dimensional date table here. So this is actually your dates table. Then you would link the relationship here, you would link the relationship here. And what we recommend from a guidance standpoint is when you're doing that, you'll hide these columns because you don't really want to show those dates. You don't want people to pick these dates. You actually want them to pick the original date, right? Because the filter direction will push from top down this way. And then what we want from, so that's one example. Now, the other example you said, what if I have a same table that I have multiple date records in it? So maybe I have date, order date, and maybe I have shipment date, and maybe I have birth date, whatever those 3 things are. So then there's 3 separate tables. The second part that Seth was talking about was having inactive relationships. So we can have a date table that hangs out over here. This is again our dates. We have our single column that has the full day information. You can strong link to here or an active relationship to that one. You can, same column, you can inactive relationship to the other column and do a third one here. And when you write the DAX for this, you'll write a calculate statement. You'll say, so let's just say this is a sum of sales by birthday, right? So I have sum of sales by birthday. And I would say, calculate this information, use the measure that I want. And then on the end of it, I would say, use relationship. Oh, can't spell. The function is called use relationship. Relationship. And then this is where we define what is the from table and the to table for that relationship to build the connection. So what it will do is it'll say, okay, I know there's 3 connections, but I'm going to use one of these inactive ones, and I'll do the same calculation based on another time period. So this is how you get around like, hey, what if I want sales by ship dates, or what if I want sales by order dates? That's a great scenario for having one table. There is one caveat, and this is the last part here. Let's say I need a visual, and I was working with another client that was doing something similar to this. Let's say that there's like a gridded matrix, and let's say maybe I want to understand like order dates here, order dates, and then I want to see ship dates here in the same visual. So in this case, neither of those two other patterns actually work because you actually need two separate date tables to kind of help you convey the information down to this table because you can't unfilter or it'll be over filtered essentially at this table. So the only other method here is for when you need unique date tables, you have your facts table sitting out below, you have your date column in here, and then you'll actually have for each dates, you'll make a separate dates table, one for each of them. So I actually have multiple of these, and this won't, right, you're being selective, dates. You're being selective around what date tables you bring in because you're only bringing in what you really need. You could have other date tables that you're just not using or other date columns that you don't want. You don't want Power BI to actually build those tables for you. So you would just make a separate relationship to the dates, the second dates column. And now you have the full ability. Now, when we did this, we made it very clear, like this is the order dates, right? And this is the shipment dates, right? So then now I have a very clear distinction of what those measures are and what the information is coming from. And we kind of went overboard. We made each column have like the descriptor of like what kind of dates we were talking about. So for each year, month, day, it was like year order dates, year, month order dates. And that's kind of how we solved this problem as well. So either of those three solutions usually work depending on what kind of view you're going after for the visual.
Yeah, and just to kind of reinforce as we do musical chairs.
Doodle.
A lot of times people are saying, we'll recommend reduce the number of date tables, right? But what I just described was that by having that auto feature on, this is what we're doing in our model. We're creating a date dimension with that time range of whatever is in that particular table for every single date.
Yeah.
This is why your models get really, really, really big and or slow if you have a lot of dates in your
I think some people have studied this and they said like they can grow like by 20 or 30 megabytes per date table that's in that date range of like 999 to like 20, whatever it is.
All right, moving on so you have time.
Sorry.
Does that happen even if you already bring in your own calendar file, if that option is checked?
If you still have it enabled, you betcha.
I checked it.
Yep. So now that we've created some simple visualizations, we go back to Bill and we show him that, hey, we can show you sales over time. We can show you that your top sales or product is water bottles, and that's wrong. Sales amount, this, whatever. But inevitably, Bill shares this report and takes a screenshot when you're talking to him, and he shares it with Chet, the marketing guy. And Chet, I don't know why I like that, Chet, the marketing guy. Chet has seen some really cool reports on PowerBI.Tips, and he's like, hey, I want you to include survey data into this sales report as well, and I want you to generate some reports on that too. So I have this random Excel file that we generated off of some third-party software where we did a survey, and I want you to include that on the customers that you're pulling in for sales. So being the Power BI experts that you are, we can jump back out into Edit Queries and go grab the Excel file that Chet sends us called reviews. And we can pull this into our model really easily, which I'm sure all of you are aware. Yes, head nods, of course. Use first row as headers. We're gonna, look at that. We have a customer key just for me in a demo.
Huh, imagine that.
Change the date. And now we have our survey data. So what we're going to do is we're going to close and apply this. So what we notice real quick is we have two different objects in our model. And one of the things I wanted to point out is we can create a nifty, neat relationship between the customer key in both of these queries. And now with a new functionality that Power BI allows us to generate many-to-many relationships between models, people will automatically do this. It's cross-filtered in both ways, no problem, and now we can get going. The challenge here, though, is what I want to do is take a look at what the data sets in both of these queries are doing and what many-to-many does in your visualizations, which many people aren't aware of. So if we take our initial query, which is actually my product sales customer, and I take the sales amount and the customer key, I thought I changed that. In typical Power BI fashion, you're jumping in and out of the edit queries all the time, transforming the data types to the appropriate setting. So I want a decimal on the sales amount, make sure I don't have any others I have to do. Okay.
Unit price might want to be a decimal too before you close and apply.
I'm not using that.
Okay. It'll be an any.
So I'm sure you've encountered this a lot. You'll notice that what I was looking for in the sales amount was a sum, and I didn't get that because my data type was wrong in my edit queries. So be aware that when you're ingesting data in Power Query, we need the appropriate data type set there, and then we can also modify that in the model layer as well. So just because I would go to sales amount and in my model here, be able to change the data type here, that doesn't mean that I changed it in Power Query. So you need to make sure that both those are in parity. And the model can do slight adjustments. Like if I want to use, change it to a dollar amount, show it in dollars instead of a decimal. That's where that model alteration will work real well. So I'm going to sum this, and then I'll notice that I have my customer keys and my sales amount per customer. So I'm going to grab, in our scenario, I'm a model guy. I just pulled in my customers from my survey data. I'm going to pull in the sales amount data. So what I want to do is grab my customer key. I'm going to drag that over, and I'm going to do the sales amount. And what we'll notice on the bottom is my totals are the same. Can anybody notice anything else? I'll make it easy. The top row on my right-hand table, my customer key is 11,000. My customer key in my other table does not start with 11,000. Well, that must be a sorting error, right? So let's just resort, and it's not there. So with a many-to-many relationship, if my starting table or the table that I'm in does not contain that key in the other table, it won't return it, and it won't return a blank either. So my overall numbers don't change, but my visualizations and what I'm actually returning could be wrong. I'm not saying it's wrong every time, but you have to be really cautious and understand that type of relationship without just defaulting and saying, Power BI understands this relationship, I don't have to correctly model anything. This is why we hammer home a lot when we're generating reports, even if it is from Excel files or random things. What we would want to do is have some thought around what are my facts and what are my dimensions. My dimensions are my unique list with the descriptor of, like in this case, we can create a simple customer, we can create a simple product table, and I have my sales. So I have a customer and product, my sales, and my survey can hang off of my product. So I'm going to do that real quick. I'm not going to do that real quick. I'm going to talk through it, and I'll show it to you just because, for time's sake, I want to give Mike a lot of time. But what I'm saying, and I'm actually going to show it in a different file just so we're to that point. So I'm going to jump ahead. Is if I reshape this data, what I can do is I can take that original query, and while that's loading, I will jump into here. I'll go back into my edit queries, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to reference this initial table and create distinct lists off it. So we have two different options here. I can duplicate this table. If I duplicate it, what it's going to do is it's going to copy all of the same steps, the source, all of the M query, and it's going to be a separate query that generates exactly the same steps. That's really useful if I want to modify the steps in a separate query but on the same data source. In this case, I'm just going to remove, take that initial table and all those steps as my starting point, and then make any modifications in this new query in the new one. Does that make sense? So if I want to modify steps in a query I already built, I might want to duplicate, so I can remove some of those pre-steps. If I want to keep all of those and then move on, I can use a reference.
Seth, on the reference, there are two settings, enable and load, I think. So
Yep.
how do you know,
Yes.
what those exactly do? Because I think you can turn some of those off.
Yep.
It saves resources.
It does.
Yep.
So actually, I'll go to the board
So
on that.
well,
Go
are
ahead.
you going to talk or draw?
I was going to draw a little bit.
So the other thing, when kind of a rule of thumb I learned from Gil's book, by the way, I wrote a blog on like how to get started with Power Query. Gil Raviv wrote a fantastic book. I love it, and some of the tips that I'm like providing are from that as well. Rather than selectively choose columns, what is always a good practice is to select the ones you want and remove the other. So that way, if the file that you're working with kind of changes, nothing happens, because the only columns you care about, if those break, you really care. But if something else gets removed, if I'm specifically saying remove this column, remove this column, remove this column, and that's in my M code, now my M code's going to break when it doesn't need to.
Correct. It's like protection against like changes to your data sets. So to answer your, enable in the reports, there's like two settings there. The one I use is the top setting, which is enable in the data set. So, two points, right? So I have in the query editor, I have like two queries over here on the right-hand side, and each one of these maybe has multiple steps, right? So we have something with maybe 2 steps and maybe with 3 steps. When I do a reference, the reference makes a brand new table and basically picks up where the last one left off and makes a new step and says, okay, we're going to do all these steps. Now, your question was, hey, what happens if I disable that previous query? So we can go in there and say, okay, we can turn enable load off. So I think enable load, I think is the setting. When you turn that off, it doesn't take the data and bring it into the data model, but it still uses the steps to go backwards to get the information. So that's the one, if you're not going to use this data in a report, or this is like a cleaning step, or this is maybe you're taking some information and get a distinct list of values, or something along those lines that you're going to use later on, I recommend turning this off, because it does save memory when you go to the model, because the table doesn't show up. And frankly, from my point, I like not confusing the end users. The end users get really confused when there's a bunch of extra tables that you're not using in the data model. So a lot of these things I'll clean up and turn off the enable load. I'm not sure what the second half of that button is. If you right-click Steph on one of those tables. Include and report refresh. So the other half of that one is, so you can leave it enabled, but you can turn it off from the report refresh standpoint. So and that happens when you automatically refresh the report or schedule a refresh the report, it won't automatically pick up that table and load it. You
want the data refreshed every time.
You should always leave that one checked on.
So I usually use both the reference and the original.
Yeah, I never touch the bottom one. I only touch the top one. That's the one I typically do.
Okay, I usually end up using them both, so I would leave both of those checked then, I guess.
Yeah, if you're going to use that table in the actual model, like inside the report later on. I just drew on myself. I'm getting ink everywhere. I would definitely, they leave those both on.
Okay, thanks.
So what I did while Mike was talking, because he's really long-winded, is create all those tables. So what you'll notice is what I was doing was using that initial table as the reference. I was taking out the customer key and customer information, removing duplicates from that. So I was creating unique record lists for those dimensions of customer and product, and then left everything in sales only with the keys. So I had the 2 keys for customer and product, and then the sales information. So now I have a clean dimensional model that I can create in Power BI. One other quick tip that I want to reference in, actually two, in the Power Query is under product name, let's for instance say that I don't want to include any of my mountain bikes, or I want to exclude a specific model. If I go into and start typing mountain, it will filter down my data set and say I don't want the black 138, and I click OK. What we'll notice is that my code here basically says for each product name, fender set, select any of the other ones except for that, right? But if I choose, it hates me, got angry at me.
Did get angry at you?
Wow, how did that happen? Did not want that.
It's coming up behind the scene, isn't it? Maybe it's got a lot in there. Oh, there it goes.
This what? Demos. In any case, essentially what happens here is if you do a search, which more oftentimes when we're searching to filter out something within a data set, if you select one, it works. If you select more than one, what often happens is Power Query, and this is why you keep your eye on the code that's being generated, is it will filter down your set of data to the searched set only. So it'll say where it's not this, but it is a mountain, something, right? So be cautious. The tip is be cautious when you're applying filters to make sure that the filter that the M code is generating is what you expect, in that it's only going to exclude the one thing that you wanted to do versus the reverse of you're excluding these two, but you're selecting your search criteria. So it's something that you just got to keep an eye on.
Yeah, so that code changes based on what you've selected.
I'm angry. Didn't work. Anyway, one other thing that just came out that I want to point out. Under Tools, there's if you weren't aware, in Power BI, I think 2 or 3 months ago, there was a new analyzer pane. So you can see as your report is generating the queries for all the different visualizations, the DAX timings, all of the different durations that each of the things are happening on the report page. You can enable that in the report layer. And maybe Mike can show that if I got some quizzical looks. They just enabled those diagnostics in Power Query. So what's neat is under Tools, if I start my diagnostics and then kick off a refresh of this particular preview, and while that's generating, maybe I want to make some other transformational steps. What's happening behind the scenes is Power BI is keeping track of those timings within M. And say I want to filter out black, and I click OK. And then under Tools, I'm going to stop diagnostics. What you'll notice is there are 2 new queries that just showed up, and I haven't dug into this a ton, but the data sets for all of those timings, the categories, the different queries that are being generated, et cetera, are now a new query that by default are disabled and not enabled to load into my model. But if I do enable that, now when I go back and I can close and apply, that'll show up in my fields list. Here's my diagnostics. And what's great about this versus the other one is now I can automatically report on the data set. Right, so I can actually build some visualizations around how long are some of my timings taking. So if I go to the particular operation, the exclusive duration, so we'll see that here are a bunch of metrics that I can produce and analyze over long-running queries. Why is something taking forever? It's because you're using OData. Things like that, where you're calling systems, you can see how long it's taking to extract information, how long particular functions are taking, et cetera, et cetera. So super useful, and we'll probably do something related to diving into this deeper and giving some better insights into all of the different things that you can generate. But just know that you're there. So if you're troubleshooting a lot of the things in data load, this is a huge new tool to help you start to figure out what's happening.
But it only refreshes when you execute the...
Don't know.
We'll get back to you on that one.
It may be a start-stop as you're performing different activities, but it's likely on the load, is my guess, is when I'm refreshing a particular thing, I want it to run through all the M code. In just spitballing, you could probably comment out certain sections of your M code if you think there's a problem in certain areas. But I think based on what I've done so far, it should separate out all of the different functions that are happening to help you figure out.
This is something that the Power Query engine has never had before. It's always been a mystery to a lot of even the MVPs, where we don't know what it does. I mean, there's some people who really dig into it, but there's not really good metrics that come out of it. So this is like the first time we're seeing good details and metrics popping out of stuff.
So we see essentially that bringing in product, for some reason, that product key, whatever. So now we have a dimensional model. I'll hook up product into sales, and we have a model that we can now use to generate this report and others, just in case we have another chat who says, hey, now I want to bring in this data set. We have something that can handle that easily. So once we have this model, a lot of times what we're starting to do in practice is I won't even build a report in here anymore. What I will do is I will just, on the front page of this particular report, I'll delete all the tabs, and on a single page say, this is my customer sales report model, and I deploy that. So once we publish this to Power BI, a data set's created and a report in the same way, and it's called the model. So what Mike's going to show you then is, now that I've deployed this model that serves no purpose, I essentially have an analysis services tabular model that I can now access via a connection called Power BI datasets.
All right, we'll do a transition. Transitions. So I'm going to play at the computer now. Hopefully I don't screw up too bad. So Seth's been doing a lot of model building pieces, and so now this is like the first half of the story, is trying to get all the data smushed together through Power Query. We're going to try and build something else here on the latter half of this. So let's go over here to, let's just check out the data source. Let's go to app.powerbi.com. Sure, you're already signed in. Let's just use another one. I'll use mine just so we can see it's different. Password works. Don't save it, because then Seth has it. Not now, go away. All right, so here we are in the data set. So I know we're in a workspace called PowerBI.Tips demo site. So we have an existing report in here already, but here is basically the report that Seth had previously published, right? So this is a report. There are no pages. It's just a data set. So if we edit this report here in the service, you'll be able to see we do in fact have some tables in here, and that's kind of what we're going after here initially. So the goal of this is to, how do we get this into other reports? What's like the path, right? So this is the data model. This is the one that we would continually update. If we're going to add more tables, if we're going to change the measure calculations, we would do that here. All the formatting we would do in this file, and then just publish that file back out. So we've essentially built out this first half of, I have a bunch of data, I've engineered it, and now I have a model. So the data model now lives out here. So this is basically as far as we've gotten. My data engineers back here. We've produced the model, and we're not going to have any reports with this. So the goal now is to quickly go into this and snag a couple extra reports, and how we build some reports off of this model from there. Another concept I want to talk about, and it alludes very well to this, is the difference between like a global measure and a local measure. So I think there's not been a lot of communication on the community about this, but I think it's something that's going to get more important as we start working towards this model. A global calculation would be, I have a sales column. I would want to do sum of sales. All right, that's something that should be in like every single report. That makes sense. There are other calculations, like something very specific to a particular visual. Maybe it's a very specific calculation statement. Maybe it's a slicer that I have to detect the value and then add that value to something else using a switch statement. So there's like other things that maybe are more report specific, and they're usually around how do I make that one visual do what I want. But those are not necessarily understandable or clear to everyone else who's using the reports or using the main data model. So I'm going to try and open up. Do you still have that? This model only has a sales report data set on your computer? Is that still around here?
Yeah, it's in the model. Under the folder, same folder structure.
Okay. Okay. It's just the...
I don't think I have it open though. It's the one that's highlighted.
This one? Okay. So I'm going to start here in the file. So I'm actually going to make a global measure or two, and then we'll build a local measure, and we'll start from there. So the idea is when we publish those global measures, it'll be available to all reporting people or all other reports. And then when we make a local one, it's only available in my report. So I'm going to enhance the data model here slightly. I'm going to go over to sales. I don't want to see myself. Thank you. I'll go over to sales, and we're going to go after the sales amount. So right click here. I'll say new measure. It'll then bring up the measure column here. Let's see, do you have zoom it? So we'll just say total sales. Do a quick sum, and we'll go after sales amount. Sales amount, there it is. Drop that guy in there, and that may be what we want for this calculation. We may want another calculation that might be like a year-to-date calculation or something else that's going on there. So let's do another measure on top of that as well. So this is year-to-date, year-to-date. Let's try and spell it right. So this will be total year-to-date calculation. Now, this is an interesting, so we talked earlier about like date tables and how they best serve their purpose here. When we're using some of these total year-to-date things, it's good to have a robust date table to help support some of those things. Sometimes these time calculations get, depending on what you're using, get a little tricky when you're using date tables to hang off of things. So another trick that I like to use, or technique, I guess this would be more of a technique than a trick, is reuse as many calculations as you possibly can. So if you're going to do a sum of some column and you're going to reuse that value in multiple other calculations, you want to try to reuse that calculation over and over again by building it once and then just referring to it in other places as well. So total sales, and then for here, the date range I'm looking for is now order dates. So I'm going to go after the sales order dates column. And I think I need date on the end of this because this has got the dates turned on. I'll hit enter on here. And I'm just going to verify that this is going to work before I publish this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scrub up a quick page here. I'm just going to verify that I've got order dates on the page. Let's not use this one because it needs to be a straight order date. Drop the year-to-date function in there. And let's see if that's going to order date. I don't think it likes the dot date on the end of this here. Let me change that real quick. It put it back. Stop it. That's what I'm looking for. So that dot date on the end of that date column was saying go to the reference to date table and use the date column called date in that table. So I don't want that. I just want the straight date value. And this is giving me like my nice, for each day of the year, it's going to continually accumulate that data over and over again. All right, so we have a rough example. This is working. Okay, great. Get rid of this guy. We don't know him. We don't need him. Delete that guy. Let's build another calculation. Let's get the year-to-date calculation of last year. So we'll say last year, year-to-date as well. And then this will be a calculate statement where we will take the current year-to-date, because I've already calculated it once, and I'll say same period last year, and I'll use that same dates column, order date, don't put the end, and we'll close it off. So now I've got a last year year-to-date column as well. We can verify this as well by grabbing a little line chart, and we will just double check this one. So let's say the year-to-date this one, last year year-to-date, and we want to make sure that we drag the date column to the axis, and let's not use that. Let's do order dates. So now I've got two lines, so it's shifting the last year's date. So the dark blue line is the actual year-to-date calculation, and then the dark blue line is it's shifting it 1 year ahead. So basically that's the prior year's time calculation. We'll use this later on when we build our report. So this is just me kind of spot checking things, making sure that it looks appropriate, and I think we're good here. So now I can get rid of this guy. Okay, we've added some measures to this data model. I think this looks good for now, and I'm going to kind of move quickly because we're getting close to an hour. So I will publish this to the service by clicking the publish button. Oh, I really wish you had zoom it. You've got to have it. Yeah, zoom it. Okay. Boom. We'll click this on the home ribbon. We'll go ahead and click the publish button. Bada bing, bada boom. Save the changes. Okay. We are going to publish it into the demo site. Got it. Select. Sure, replace it. Okay. Maybe. Okay, internet's good. We've got it, success. All right, so next we will get out of this file because now we're done building files, and now we want to start, refreshing here. If I refresh this page, we should automatically see edit this report. Now the sales table should have our additional calculations. So there we are. Let's minimize this and minimize that. We're going to start now with a fresh desktop. So I'm just going to say right-click, Power BI Desktop. Loading, loading, loading.
Is that your loading dance?
Yeah, that's what I do that every day when I open up Power BI. I'm like, loading, loading, loading. All right, so now we're here and rocking and rolling. Let's go ahead and start a get data function. So we'll get data, and now I'm going to go to the Power BI data sets. So now we go here. And recently, I think this was in, again, alas, that's come out recently. I think this was in August. They just released the shared data sets piece too. So sometimes you'll now actually see more data sets across your organization. This dialog box is slightly changed now with that. So now I actually have to go search for what I'm looking for. So I know I'm looking for something with October, and so I can start typing in the window, and it'll just pop up my data set.
So real quick before he jumps off that, you'll notice the blank column under endorsement. That's where like the certified data sets, or like within your organization, there'll be little tags in there that start to delineate for everybody that this is a data set that's been approved by this particular department. So like the data is vetted, it's good, you can rely on it. So there's different levels that you can set up in the service that will light up those tags in there.
So if you want to know more about that, let us know. We can do a demo around making a promoted or certified data set. There's two paths to make a certified or promoted data set. Promoted, pretty much anyone can promote, but certified actually has a governing process. You can actually get that through a governing body or have an approval process to get the certified tag on stuff, which if you're not using them today, I'd highly recommend you start thinking about how you would build a process around getting a data set into certified and who would be the owner of that. I know another thing that just lit up was the ability to have owners of data sets be tagged as the owner of those data sets. So that's another thing you can link to as well. Once I have a data set in here, when it's broken or wrong, we have someone to go blame to go fix it. So that's also another good data governance kind of thing as well. So I'm going to go type in October here again. There we are, October PUG. I'm going to connect to this one. Create my report. Right now, you'll notice we're going to drop into a bunch of customer sales and products. So these are all here. And so now I can start building my report. Now, this could be unique to what I want. Seth can manage the model independently. So he can actually iterate on that model continually and keep adding more things to it. The only caveat I would say here is the downside of this is if he changes a measure's name from year to date to like year to date last year or year to date something else too, or whatever that would be. If he physically changes the name of that measure, my model won't be able to recognize that, and it won't update my report for that. It'll look for the old measure. So the caution here with doing it this way is, and with anything, right, if you build a model, you want to kind of make it as bare bones as you possibly can initially, and only put things in there you know you're going to need, because if you add a bunch of extra bloat to it, you may remove it and someone may be using it. And so that's a challenge and a trade-off that you get there as well.
So just to clarify mentally for everybody, is we had a Power BI model, we imported the data into it, we published it to the Power BI service. We're now connecting to that same model, and you'll notice that on the left-hand side, we don't have a data pane or a model pane because we have a live connection essentially to that Power BI data source, which is an analysis services model. So think of this new connection that we just created as a live connection. So there's a bunch of restrictions as far as like what we can do and modify within this particular report. But the gains that you have as it relates to being able to extend many reports off a single model kind of outweigh the pain of like having two desktop files open at the same time, right? I have my model. If I want it to be a model change that affects everything, I'll just be in there, publish it, and then my reports, will be that live connection.
So because we're running out of time, I'm going to just kind of quickly whip out a report here. So I'm going to bring my order date, and I'm going to bring total sales in here as value. So then I can see here's all my company sales historically. Maybe I want to enhance this slightly, and I'm going to try and do this quickly. We'll see how fast we can get through this. So maybe I want to look at what was the year-to-year change. A lot of what I've been working on recently has been performance management, right? How do we know how good we're doing? And a lot of the performance is, companies have goals and targets to get to, but usually that data is not in a very easy to consume area. It's usually an Excel sheet or something that's kind of a bit off the grid. But there always is last year's sales. So usually a key metric that most of these performance dashboards look at is, hey, how do we do this year versus last year? So I will go ahead and grab another line chart. Actually, let's go with that. Then I will add the order date again as our axis. We'll make this just a straight order date. We're going to bring in the year-to-date values, and then we'll bring in the last year-to-date. So, oops. Yeah, okay, it's showing it now. So this is good, but to a point. So it's great from a performance standpoint. I can see what I did cumulatively this year versus last year, and if I'm looking at just the year, a current year, right? So this data set basically cuts off here at this end, but if you're looking at 1 year at a given time, it will help you filter that information down. And really I can say is one line above the other or below the other. So right here I can say, okay, my year-to-date calculation was 4 million this year. Last year was at 5 million. I was underperforming that whole year. So we didn't actually perform as well. But the interesting part of this graph really isn't the fact that it's sawtoothing. It really isn't the fact that there's two lines on there. The important part of this graph, I would argue, is the difference between the two lines. So we actually want the delta, the area between the curves. That's the important part for us. So in order for us to see performance year to year, month to month, whatever that looks like in a nice clean bar graph, if we're having the same performance, I'll draw the graph that I'm going to build. If we have the same performance year over year, and I have every single day on a line chart, the performance, if we stay straight on this line, year-to-date change versus year-to-date change, that means we've had exactly the same sales. If this line goes up, we know we're outperforming versus last year, and we can see at which month we are doing better than we were last year. If we start losing compared to last year, that line will start going down. And then if we start doing really bad, we'll actually go below the line, and this means now we're underperforming based on last year. And that's cumulative for all the sales from like the beginning of the fiscal year to where it is right now. So it's kind of one of those nice long rolling pictures of how performance we're doing inside a report. So let's build that measure. So we're going to make a new measure now. We're going to use our two year-to-date calculations, and we're going to add another one. So we're going to say this is our delta year-to-date calculation, and here we'll just take the measure year-to-date, and we'll subtract off last year's year-to-date, and this should give us the change, the rate of the change between the 2 years as a cumulative total. So let's copy this graph down. Control-C, Control-V. Nope. Control-C, Control-V. Helps if I hit the right buttons. Let's get rid of one of these and that one. And now let's bring in the delta year-to-date values. And while this is quite an interesting graph, you can now kind of start seeing where the trend is. So based on this prior trend here, we know we were losing in the year 2012 compared to 2011. And that's what we're seeing on this downward tick here. So this downward curve, and these are likely blips here because of bad date ranges where they're not comparable prior year. But you can see here, in all of 2012, we were underperforming. We did not do as well as we did the prior year. And then as soon as we hit 2013 sales were tremendously up compared to 2012. And now you're seeing the curve ramp up in a higher volume on that ramp. So now we know we're doing much better than the prior year. You can turn this into a bar chart, and then you can do some fancy formatting on this. So we can change Let's see if I can do this without screwing it up. Conditional formatting on the date colors. We can now change this to a color scale. I want it to do it on the delta year to date. The lowest value will be red, and the highest value will be dark blue. Oh, that's a good color band. And there we go. So now I've got a color gradient that goes across all my data points and verifies that that's in fact doing what I want. I think there's even, if you add diverging here in the middle, you can drop in a middle value and say this is not a value, instead it's straight a number. And then you can say, okay, everything above the line will be yellow or blue, and anything below the line would be yellow or red. So now you got to now we have like this pretty interesting like visual pick of what we're looking at. It's now just if it's below the line, it's bad. If it's red, it's bad. If it's blue, it's good. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with a lot of these visuals from a visual concept standpoint, is make it very clear. Is like when I glance at it, we kind of know what we're looking at. And you can see here on the very front end of this, 2014 is looking like a bad year already because it's already going down initially, and that's what we want to see as soon as possible, so we can make a decision to do something about that action. So we want to call to action to this step. Okay. Any questions about the calculations? Randomly putting some graphs on the page. It's pretty-ish. We'll go from here and let's publish this report. So now that we're done with this one, I'm going to Control S, so save this one. I'm just going to drop it on the desktop and just say sales report. And then we'll drop it on the desktop and we'll hit save. And now I'll publish this one. And now we will publish it. So another thing to note here is before, when I was publishing the data set, you notice that it had many different workspaces to publish into. This one recognizes the data set is in this workspace and is requiring me to publish this data set directly to this workspace. So it narrows my vision down of where I can publish to. I'll hit select. It'll now publish this. Another keynote here is, and then, oh man, there's so many good points on this. Sorry. I'm going to go another rabbit trail. This report file size is much smaller now. So this is purely almost metadata at this point. I built one extra measure. I connected to a data model. This thing is basically lightweight. So if I'm going to store something from like a documentation standpoint, or if I'm going to store it in like a GitHub or a repo or dev QA prod type stuff, saving this file is much smaller than having to save a data model every single time. So one thing I was observing when we were doing this in Azure Visual Studio, when you're managing with a GitHub, there's a size limit of those files, and if you save like a 500 megabyte file and you're saving every single change of a PBIX file that's always changing, it starts puking because there's so many large files in your GitHub repo. So this is another more efficient way of storing the reports independently of storing the data set.
Yeah, that's a really great point too, especially if you
Of course it was. I wouldn't say if it wasn't. Jeez.
Especially if you have capacity, right? So even on the lower tiers of like an A1 embedded SKU where you have like 2 gig or something, it's like 2 for a 10 gig, even on a P1 premium. If you have multiple reports and you're duplicating data sets in every model that you're generating, as opposed to having one big model and your reports filtering down or trimming off of that model, like imagine how much space you're saving and or potential cost savings with not having to spool up additional A SKUs to support those embedded workspaces.
That's a way better point than mine was, because that's money in the bank right there. Money. So yeah, so just to show you scale of files right here, the properties of this file that I just made was 8 megabytes or 8 kilobytes. So sorry, 8,000 kilobytes versus the data set version of this, which is almost a meg. So again, we're not working with really large data set sizes, but when these things get into the hundreds of megs, you now can see quite a substantial cost savings, potentially even going to premium for those kind of things as well. Okay, we're done with this one now. Let's hop back over to the service, hopefully. I'm going to go back into my workspace now, and we'll go back to the demo site. I'll go into the reports, and then now here's my sales report. So this is the report that we just built. It's on that other data set. It's already there. Let's build one more while we're at it to see if we can add another one here real quick at the end. So I'm going to go to a nice website that I like, PowerBI.Tips/layouts. So this is kind of really where the layouts idea spawned from, but as we're looking at like how the tooling and the service is changing, this is making this story much more compelling from a build a template and start there kind of thing. So the report I built was kind of sucky and not very great. Let's try and build another one that looks more decent. Let's go to, let's pick this one. So this is the slicer's right layout. We'll start with this one. I'm going to just download it. It'll then dump a zip file somewhere on my computer. So let's show where it goes. Show in folder. I'm just going to zip it out here to the desktop. Close that out. OK, so we got the file now. So now I can unzip this thing. And I'm going to close out my other Power BI file here. I don't need this one anymore. Sales report's done. So in these, there's a number of JSON theme files and some instructions that go along with them. A template file that is basically a dummy file that you can just start with. There's a PBIX file, which is typically the demo file. That's the file that has like visuals pre-built in there to show you how it may work. But if you start with the template file, it'll then load this file with no data source attached. So the cool part is now that we have this model that we've kind of built and we've kind of figured some things out with it, it'll then bring you to this file, and then I can have these different layouts. Let's go here to something that maybe doesn't have any pages on it.
That's an old school one.
Oh, this is a really old one.
Should clean that up.
Yeah, we should clean that up. We'll clean that up later. So if I go in here now and say get data, I can go get some data, and then I can go grab from, oops, I don't want that. I want the bottom half. We can go now to our Power BI data sets. We can then go grab our data set again, October. So there's our October data set, and I've got my second report now hanging off of this data set. Boom, and now we're here back to where we were. All the measures have been pre-calculated for me in my sales, and so in some of these older layouts, you can actually go through and fix the fields. I'm going to say this is going to be something like total sales, and we'll see what that produces. And this looks like a map, so we can't have. I don't have any mapping data. Do I have any mapping data?
No.
I don't think I have any in this data set. Let's change this map to just a bar chart. Maybe I will. Let's get rid of these crappy fields. Let's change it to a bar chart. And then now that we have a bar chart there, we can then add something like same thing. There's our order date for Axis. And let's just do straight order dates again. And then we can do our year to dates as values. And there's our graph again. And this one's already been pre-styled. So it's already got a color palette applied to it. And then you can go through and then kind of adjust these other measures here. And see, this is the new thing. Something has changed in the Power BI desktop. In our first version of all of our layouts, we kind of had these like broken visuals to like help you kind of get key KPIs where they needed to live. If you remove the data field that was broken, it said fix this, it just deleted the visual. It just was poof, gone. They've changed it, so the behavior now is I can actually have visuals on page where I can remove broken fields. This is actually a good trick. You can just get rid of all those, and now I can have all these slicers on the right-hand side here that now I can reuse them with other data sets. So I can go up here and say, okay, this is a slicer. Let's drop in the customer key for this one. This one can now be, let's see, your product color. You can drop in product name here. And so now I've got kind of a rough layout of when I select certain things, stuff starts changing based on the information. So the goal of these layouts is to kind of like, you can set up templates or things that are at your company that are like very consistent on how you want to build things. And that way everyone's getting the same kind of view of the realm, or their layouts are all the same. So now that we're done with this half-hearted built report, we can then publish this one back out to the servers the same way we did the other one. And now we'll save our changes. It'll then make me save the file. So I'll drop this in this new one here. This is my new sales report. We'll hit save here on the desktop. This file's away. We'll publish it back out to the service. And come on, there it is, got it. And now we can go back to the service again one last time. And now we've made two reports off of the same data model, but are living in the same workspace. So now we've got kind of like this nice clean effect here. If you go into the data sets area, you'll notice we only have one data set for all those reports, which also keeps things nice and clean from the data set standpoint. So That's like a lot of information. We kind of like massively dumped on you.
We made it through the desktop.
We made it through the desktop.
Looks like we have to do a whole service one.
Yeah. And are there any questions about like what we did? Does it make sense? Is there any like, you want to tell us it's a stupid idea? And
It makes it easier when you only have one data model for when you schedule your refresh.
it totally does.
Okay, and one of the things that we do is we have a production version, so it's October PUG model,
Yep.
and then we'll do October PUG
Dev.
model underscore test.
Yep.
So then if you're going to change your data model, then we have it out there on the workspace. No, it's not connected to the app at that point.
Yep.
You can still take your visuals that you have, redirect it to the test.
Yep.
And see if something else is broken.
Correct. Yes, you can point to different directions.
Right.
I'm technically not on premium at this point. At least this workspace is not. I believe we do have a premium workspace in here as well. And there are settings. Hold on. In premium, you do get an endpoint. So in premium, so we were publishing a data set to the service. That's all analysis services, Azure Analysis Service. It's all managed for you. You don't have to go spin up a machine. You don't have to turn anything on. Inside the service, there is a Power BI endpoint, and this is the analysis services endpoint that you can go hit and go access with other reports. So if I wanted to go, going on a limb here, if I grab this endpoint, hopefully my premium is still on. I pause it a lot, so this may not work. But I can go back to desktop again, and you can, from the service, go grab that URL link and drop that in as if you were connecting directly into analysis services, and it'll still work. You can also get a bunch of other interesting things off that AS model, like the DMVs, dynamic management views, off of that model. So you can go look at other models that are out there, document them essentially from that endpoint as well. So we can go here, get data, analysis services, drop in the server name, do it right, drop in the server name, Control V, maybe I didn't paste it. Man, me and my key swipes right now. Control C, Control V, there it is. Now I've got it in there. I'm gonna live connect to that model. I'll hit OK. It should make me sign in. I'm going to use Seth's credentials. And I think it errored. OK, I think it because I don't have the premium on. I had paused my premium. I'm using an A SKU. But if my premium was on, this would then do the same thing we were doing before. The data set would light up, all the fields would populate, and then we'd be able to start building reports right there. So this really is, this is really acting like the business, like we want to go quickly, we got to develop fast, but then taking more of an IT approach of like breaking things out and thinking a bit more strategic around where do we put the model, how many reports are hanging off of that model, how do we store them efficiently, those kind of aspects as well. Okay. I say with that, we cut it.
It's a wrap.
I think we're about out of time. I think the video officially stops at like 7:30 tonight. So thanks for coming on the webinar, guys. I appreciate you guys attending. We'll have it up on YouTube for, I don't know why I'm telling you that, because this is going to be on YouTube eventually. Thanks for coming. I hope you enjoy the content. We'll talk to you guys in another month. It's the last Tuesday of every month. We're going to try and do one of these.